I'm sure that at the back of Barthes' mind was this fabulous quotation from Mallarmé, destruction was my Beatrice, like Dante in Beatrice, Mallarmé being in love with destruction. And I'd just like to say that this is something I've always wanted to do, and the time in which I've been able to do what I've been able to do hasn't been enough to reduce and make even more perfect. So the talk I want to give is absent, and absence is the theme of my talk. So is this the box to end all boxes? This is Aspen number 5 to 6 with the authors of this talk's hand in the way. While the famous Aspen 5 plus 6, guest edited by Brian O'Doherty, is the minimalism number, it is dedicated for Stéphane Mallarmé, an homage to the French symbolist poet. It's not just a magazine in a box, of course. It is a dream box of O'Doherty's most loved, with selected elements that make it a kind of desert island discs of modernism. For those Polish people who don't know this long-running radio program, you've got famous people to say which 8 things, if you had to, would you take onto a desert island. So obviously you could have a completely alternative Aspen 5 plus 6, even selected by Doherty himself. And it's this aleatoric chance element, of course, which brings us again back to Mallarmé. Of course, in Aspen 5 plus 6, the absolutely contemporary is in dialogue with the historical landmark moments, as I will demonstrate. And O'Doherty's genius as novelist, critic, and future author of the very famous text Inside the White Cube was not only that of a curator of the box, as it were, avant la lettre, but also as a commissioner of text, because, of course, this provides the first home for Roland Barthes' The Death of the Author. The Death of the Author is a work which has transcended its context. It has far transcended Duchamp's little-known creative act text, which also features in the box, and indeed one can argue the whole contents of the box. But we can assume it was produced to order with no real knowledge by Barthes of the other box contents. And also, of course, I would like to go into all of this at manuscript and archive level, Barthes-wise, and haven't yet been able to do so. But bear in mind that Roland Barthes was not an art historian. The National Museum in Paris was extremely conservative at the time. Dada was hardly known. The first retrospective outside France began in Düsseldorf in 1957. The first Duchamp retrospective was 10 years away in Paris in 1977. And it's highly unlikely, in my opinion, that Barthes would have bought the 1959 trilingual monograph on Duchamp that the kind of Duchamp coterie were into, because he was really in his ivory tower of the École Normale Supérieure and involved with the problem of writing. But what I'm interested, therefore, is the context of the box as a kind of frame for the death of the author, and it's, if you like to use Barthes' own structuralist terms, the synchronic context of the box and the kind of diachronic, time-based axis which takes us back to Mallarmé. Obviously, a previous precursor in book form, one could argue, would be Robert Motherwell's anthology, The Dada Painters and Poets, published in 1951, which again, for example, consulted the still-living Dada artist Richard Hulsenbeck, who features here and who was currently a psychoanalyst in New York. And one of the themes of my overlong presentation, which I'm going to try and zap through, is like who wins, who loses. Because basically, I think that, strangely enough, Mallarmé, rather than Barthes or indeed Brian or O'Doherty, actually wins. So on to Mallarmé. Oh, yes, I wanted to say, of course, that this is the ad inside the box for the order form for Aspen. And, of course, immediately you see that Aspen has its kind of own outreach program. This is also a piece of paper that has to be folded and pleated before posted and travel through time and space. Which brings us back to one of my favourite objects in the world, Mallarmé's beautiful fan piece. He made about 20 of these fans and wrote his poems on the fan. And of course, this is a particular fan because it's white. Now, a fan piece is a Chinese idea. It links us up to a kind of East-West dialogue. It reminds us that at this moment, Whistler's Little White Girl painting was the kind of Mallarmé white square of its time. It's pleated, and so it's a physical object in the world. It's a love poem. It's sent to somebody else, and of course a fan had its own language. It's something that can be fluttered, or you can wrap somebody with a fan. And the other thing is, of course, that when in 2007, very late in the day, the psychoanalyst Jacques Attier came to think about Mallarmé and le livre. Every time, dear translators, I say le livre, I mean book, okay, translated as book in Polish. So every time, the Jacques Attier says that, of course, this is a supremely female object, that, of course, this non-existent book I'm going to describe by Mallarmé is, of course, woman. So there are all these things already involved in this complex object, which is really the great precursor object, in my opinion, for Aspen. But of course, there's another big and not so poetic and very male precursor object, which is Duchamp's fountain, in terms of a disappeared or a fake author Armut. And what I'm showing you is not just any old of the innumerable, something like already 500 replicas of Duchamp's work called Fountain, NB inverted, which I never knew, having been not very experienced with urinals when I first introduced to this. But this is the object which disappeared. This is the absent object, because this is the photograph of the real first object in Blind Man that was removed and disappeared. So Duchamp, probably removed by Duchamp, so Duchamp cunningly creating a completely absent work is another very important precursor. And of course, the thing that's important to realize is in 1967, when Aspen is made, Duchamp is alive and well, participating in things. Here he is at a Daniel Buren event in Paris. And people, of course, don't know, Susan Sontag, when she writes in the book about Duchamp, and silence and stopping making work, nobody knows that Duchamp is clandestinely making his work étant donné, which will only be revealed posthumously and give everybody else a surprise. So it's quite interesting, the presence and absence of Duchamp. He has also some texts of 1913, as well as his creative act piece. And this is 1967. The Aspen is 1967, this is Duchamp in 1967, and one must remember that in 1966, the American, generally French-based scholar Robert Cohen produced a book called Mallarmé's masterwork, New Findings. So the point is that Mallarmé, while there's a long history with Barthes, in English there's a new book that's just come out with Mallarmé that people are reading. And of course, the other big thing is the fact that at this moment, not even reproduced in the box, is Mallarmé's White Square. And this text, called The Russian Desert, A Note on Our State of Knowledge, is a kind of historiographical piece which takes us from Michel Sufort, Camilla Gray's important book of 1962 about Russian constructivism, through one or two hints about Polish and Czech scholars. Doesn't really mention the Stedelijk exhibition. It says that MoMA's going to do an exhibition in 1969. But the fact that Malevich himself is a kind of mystery. His White Square isn't a work belonging to the MoMA collections. This is another aspect of whiteness, of a kind of minimalism before minimalism that haunts the white box without actually existing within it. So the white box, I'm calling it the white box. Aspen has an inside and an outside and a kind of haunted presence, as well as the physical presence of minimalism. Tony Smith's The Maze, with an actual photograph of one of his minimalist sculptures, is one of the only kind of works that refer to a three-dimensional object outside the box, inside the box. And he's the only one who really takes up the idea of the box as a plaything with his do-it-yourself minimalist sculpture, of course, here in this case, transferring authorship. Bochener, of course, we've mentioned before, he is using the box as a kind of mini system sculpture. I won't read all these things. The tiers at the top are like the tiers of a wedding cake. There's not only this idea of a magic square, but the new impact of, and this is the way you can play with the translucent things. I actually clandestinely made scans of this only other existing white box in the Pompidou Centre just before coming, and I was amazed they let me do it, basically. But so I've tried to show you these transparent layers. And of course, people said that when the MoMA did the 1970 information exhibition, it was the end of a decade of pop art. That hadn't quite happened. There's also, of course, the plus minus of binary numbers and the way this is going to translate into computer languages. And Brian, of course, I thought that he wouldn't be here as an author, but he is actually here as a named author of the box. And this is his piece. I've just shown that it's an unfolding piece. I won't actually go into it. But what's funny is he has one of his pseudonyms, Sigmund Bode, and a fake book of 1928 called Placement as Language, as another element. I've forgotten already to say that when I was showing the Tony Smith sculpture, that 67, the same year, is the year of Michael Fried's, I've just had a brain failure, what's it called? Yeah, of course, art and objecthood. I was just thinking of art and objecthood, and so importantly, Jacques Derrida's Writing and Difference, which has as its epigraph Mallarmé's quotation, "This is nothing but a spacing of reading, un espacement de la lecture." So we're in this incredible kind of multi-poetics. And of course, there are these three big texts, which I will both engage with. And I wanted to sort of show you here that this you can't actually read. It's an ad for everything else produced by Something Else Press, which describes the kind of another kind of sonorous cacophony of production at the time. There's Capro, the text of a happening. There's an anthology of concrete poetry. There's a 19th century book on Americana. There's Robert Filliou, the Fluxus artist, Ample Food for Stupid Thought. There's the translation of Daniel Spurr's Topography of Chance, which also is another chance idea. And in particular, something I haven't read, which is Marshall McLuhan's Voco-Visual Explorations. This links up with absolutely everything I'm going to say. Hence one's absolute need for not only these three wonderful texts, but in particular Susan Sontag's Aesthetic of Silence. And if you think of the box as shut up, it's the relationship between this cacophonous context and the idea of the silent box that is really so interesting. These three texts are of different lengths and are differently typographically arranged. George Kubler, the author of The Shape of Time, is the one I'm just going to show the arrangement of first. He says things about no two actions being alike, how one ages in between each repetitive action, how repetitive actions cannot be identical. And he's got very weird references to two articles on snails, which I have not yet divulged. So we'll leave George Kubler. And of course, Barthes and Kubler come before Susan Sontag because she's the baby. But by 66, she's already very beautiful, very prominently on the scene. And I must just tell you that I think her Aesthetics of Silence knocks The Death of the Author into a hat. It's an absolutely astounding essay about the postmodern condition. The word postmodern hyphened actually appears in the box. I think this is a very, very important moment. And from her, I'm selecting simply one or two nice phrases. The crisis of demystification. I like that antithesis, really. Silence existing as a decision. The real or fake suicides of certain authors. She talks about Kleist, Lautréamont, and then, of course, Duchamp's creative suicide, not knowing, as I say, that he's still on the go, and the postmodern condition of the artist. So her long text is in 3 columns, and Roland Barthes, I like this jolly picture of him with his incredibly new neologisms to express what he's up to structurally, produces the death of the author. What's really paradoxical about this, and this is the first place the work is framed, as I said, is it begins with a sexualization of the voice, not a dead, non-existent voice, Balzac's Sarrazin. It has got an enormously long lineage of authors in it, notably Balzac, Flaubert, Mallarmé, just for starters. And of course, its worry when it speaks about Mallarmé is the substitution of language for man. And as you all know, it says the writer becomes a scripter who is born simultaneously with the text, and the death of the author signifies the birth of the reader. But what I want to say is that, in my opinion, Barthes is supremely influenced by the history of Mallarmé's studies behind him. We know that the Coup de Dé was published in 1897, and one does not need here to go into the fact of the notion of dice throw, the double page, the orchestral composition, the semantic fields around each word, or the idea of whiteness and the differences in topography, which had such a huge effect. In 1898, the very year after this, he realized he was going to die and wrote a testimony in which he referred to what he called the monceau demi-séculaire de mes notes, the pile, the horrible kind of half-formed pile of my notes, which nobody can read. He said they mean absolutely nothing, and he gave his executor, Paul Valéry, the young poet, instructions to burn them. This is Valéry as a young man who says, I was ordered to show nothing, publish nothing, burn them. Mallarmé's son-in-law had a little fiddle with this dreadful problem about 2 years later. And really, the main idea was that these unformed piles, 202 leaves of paper. This is long before Duchamp's boxes, and I'm sure there's a link I haven't been able to establish. These little scribbled notes were the project for a book he'd had at the back of his head since 1866, since he was a young man of 23. And his statement, if you like, about this is the world exists to culminate in a book, the end product in all literature, all reality, sketched out as a proposition, not just as a dream. Now, of course, there was a kind of huge gap, although Valéry published constantly. It wasn't really about his relationship with Mallarmé. It was in 1957, which is really close to Barthes, that this book called The Livre of Mallarmé was published by Jacques Scherer. And I'm speeding up even more than I thought I would have to. But just to say, after that, this becomes a kind of current thing in Paris. For example, in 1959, a character called Jacques Polieri produces a kind of polyvisual, stereoscopic film presentation, total work of art experience, with tapes and with actors, as you can see, around the Coup de Dé. In 1960, this is the manuscript which the Bibliothèque Nationale have just acquired with Mallarmé's own little bits of red scribble. And I don't know, but I feel that it actually surfaced as a collectible object. It was bought by Pierre Berès, the lover of Christian Dior, around this time. Then in 1960, this weirdo produces, called Ernest Frankel, the transconscious drawings of Stéphane Mallarmé's Coup de Dé, with all these weird, obviously long pre-Marcel Proudhon's weird things. This is a little bit nearer to Marcel Proudhon's, but 1960. And then, of course, the South American, I've had a brain failure about the name of this South American poet, but what happens here is the transposition from concrete poetry, because Mallarmé really kick-starts this new huge concrete poetry vogue. Of course, he's a precursor of Apollinaire and the Futurists and everyone you know. And in South America, at this moment, when this coloured poem it's called something like Diaskolos, was shown to the composer Pierre Boulez, who was hanging around with Jean-Pierre Barrault's theatre troupe. The poet said to Boulez, now, how about some Mallarmé in music? Who's going to write a musical composition of Mallarmé? And Pierre Boulez says, I am, and starts writing pli selon pli, fold upon fold, whose first date, although it goes on, is 1966. He was already into this kind of aleatoric composition in his 3 sonatas for piano in 1957. And looking forward beyond the date of Aspen, he would create this complete sound environment in IRCAM at the Pompidou Centre, compose in musical, visual, collage-like blocks, and actually evolve the latest computer technology to generate the most complex time combinations. This had a thingy of something like 366 days, this computer of 1974, to generate rhythms that could not be repeated. So you can see that there's something going on here, which is linking up, of course, and looking and actually confirming the important book by Umberto Eco of 1962, produced in Italy, but published in Paris in 65, 2 years before Barthes, The Open Work. And I like this edition of 1972 on the right, which is trying to look more Aspen-like or musical box-like or whatever. And of course, if you read Opera Aperto, it's about information theory, Norbert Wiener's cybernetics, TV and aesthetics. TV is something which is actually excluded from Aspen in rather an interesting way. Finnegan's Wake. And of course, with Finnegan's Wake, Joyce espousing various different voices. So this is a crucial publication before Barthes, what I call really a rather humble effort. Of course, on the flexi discs, you've got Duchamp, Hulsenbeck, Garbo and Pevsner. Garbo is still alive, of course, in New York, their Realist Manifesto, interviews with Merce Cunningham, and so forth. And you get into this multimedia situation, which, of course, Barthes also doesn't take on, being a man of writing, with Cage not only producing a recording, but this beautiful manuscript, again with bits of transparent paper you can play with. And, of course, the films with these incredibly historic pieces, like Moholy-Nage's earliest piece of 32, mixing up, if you like, with Robert Morris's Sight, Rauschenberg, and Hans Richter, whose work was available at MoMA in the kind of film collections at MoMA, the pioneer films of the early 1920s. But what's interesting is, as has already been mentioned, this kind of do-it-yourself idea, because it's only when we get to the adverts, and the adverts are a constitutive part of the box, that you get colour and kind of the commercial and real world coming in. This is your magnetic sound projector for Super 8 films, and it's easy to add sound. Do it yourself, add your sound. What I think is interesting here is that in Mallarmé's livre, he actually had a whole kind of I've got to stop a whole thing about money and giving seminars and how much people were going to pay to listen to him, and a kind of financial relationship with the world that is actually part of the livre. I just wanted to make that link. And I wanted to just show, so I'm just going to zoom through the end. This is this commercial penetration of the purity of the white box with the ads. I think the ads are really important. And I wanted to show you after that, well, I was going to, that in fact one can offer a complete critique of Barthes' Death of the Author if we read his November 1973 seminar about how he felt when he was asked to write Roland Barthes by Roland Barthes. I've got a fabulous section on this I can't tell you all about, which is about fear, narcissism, Arthur Rimbaud's I Am Another, all sorts of things that I haven't got time now to tell you about. It's a really great intertextual thing one could use to deconstruct Barthes' Death of the Author. I just wanted to show that, in my opinion, this will really just be a zoom without names, Mallarmé actually wins, from Brutares through all sorts of weirdos to Sereth Wyn Evans, look, Ellsworth Kelly, weird lettress, Vietnamese lettress, Kerith Wyn Emmons, girl I've never heard of called Rafaela somebody. This is the livre popping up again in 2010, a pun, the livre of Mallarmé to the unarmed book. This is the big book of 2011, Walter Koenig, with lots of famous people writing and lots of famous artists in it, that is actually the catalogue of the Generali Foundation exhibition about Mallarmé that happened in Vienna in 2008. And here, fortunately for us, in 2011, Brian O'Doherty himself stars in an exhibition in Brussels in a space called Erg, with obviously the kind of MacBook version of Aspen on a Mac as a kind of conceptual work in a space with works by Robert Breer and other artists. So here, of course, is Brian Doherty as a real author, an incredible person. And I wanted to end with this really jolly little picture that Mallarmé had been able to turn the printed page into the stars of the midnight sky. And I wanted to end by saying that I like the idea that in some virtual space beyond the midnight sky, Mallarmé, Barthes, Brian O'Doherty, and Tim Berners-Lee, inventor of the internet, could actually have a very happy extraterrestrial meeting. Thank you.